الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي. اللهم ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. صلى الله تعالى على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وصحبه وذريته أجمعين. Okay, so we had stopped here, but let's reread this part. But surely there is the argument of this book, as we have already intimated. The argument of this book, as we have already intimated, is that any conception of a modern Islamic state is inherently self-contradictory. And we looked at this last time. Obviously, we don't accept this claim, and he hasn't provided any argument as yet, obviously. But what he means, whatever he means, I think this is not his project. His project is to just delegitimize the struggle against imperialism and modernity, and invite Muslims to accept modernity and help reform it rather. So that's his project as far as I can see at this point. But we might have to change our view as we go along. We must remember that Muslims today constitute nearly 1/5 of the world's population, and that in as much as they live in modernity. Modernity is a concept. That concept creates a world. So Muslims live in that, obviously, because that world is created by imperialism and sustained by it. They also live the modernity, like they practice modernity, but they shouldn't. They should try. So the question is whether they should live modernity, or rather they should try to overcome it. So that's the way. They are as much a part of this project as anyone else. Well, part of project in what sense? Let's see. So modernity as a project. So modernity as a project. Started in Western Europe, Northwestern Europe, and it became a dominant force throughout the world during the 19th and 20th century through imperialism. So in that sense, modernity is a worldwide civilization or barbarism, depending on your view. And that project has created a world in which we live. So obviously, everybody live in that world. That world created by modernity. Obviously, we are just following his template at the moment. So we are playing along, so to speak. So we are all live in that world. Supporters of modernity live in there, opponents live in there, middle way, people like want to reform modernity live in there. So there's no alternative in that sense. So we can't ignore the fact that we live in that world. That's why we try to understand that world. We should try to understand that world. So we live in that world, but that doesn't mean we all live. And in a sense, we all live modernity as well. We are socialized in that world. We are educated in that world. But obviously, the relationship how depends on the level of socialization. Not every country is socialized according to modernist project at the same level. So modernity has its center, its preferences, and all those things. And so Muslims, like other people, Muslims of various shade, and Muslims have, like any other community, Muslims have different relations with modernity. Let's see. So, like other people, we live in that world too, modernity, and we live modernity to the extent that we are socialized in that world. But Muslims, like other people, have different views of modernity, different relations with modernity, the modernity which they are obliged to live to a certain extent, and the modernist world in which they are almost compelled to live. I mean, we don't have any alternative. There's no other world, because it's a world historic civilization or barbarism, depending on how do you see it. So there are Muslims who are modernists. There are Muslims who are reformists, like they want modernity, and there are Muslims who are anti-modernists, want to overcome modernity. So these are three broad. Obviously, within these there are other shades as well. Okay. So what I want to say is that just because Muslims live in modernity like any other people doesn't mean that their relation to modernity is the same. Or every one of those Muslims should think that they should live in modernity, whether it's a good life, whether it's the so there are different relationships. There are Muslims who are anti-modernists, who want to overcome modernity for various reasons. But probably what he wants to do is to ask Muslims to join this group, and in a sense, accept modernity as a common fate, so to speak, and try to be Muslim within that context. So it is the argument of this book that the inherent self-contradiction entailed by a modern Islamic state. See, that's like when you don't have good philosophical training, you do these sort of things. Now he calls modern Islamic state. Before he said modern. Sorry, that's my modern Islamic states are primarily grounded in modernity's moral predicament. But is he talking about actually existing Islamic, and they are not Islamic state, by the way. So actually existing Muslim states, or the concept of Islamic state? Because except for a couple of Iran to a certain extent is the Islamic state, and Taliban to a certain extent is an Islamic state. But apart from that, which one is Islamic state? And it seems like he's talking about modernity's moral predicament. Let me write it. Modernity there. I don't know whether it is modernity is moral predicament. Obviously, if you read postmodernist literature, if you read metamodernist literature, even if you read, modernist literature itself, in different fields, you will see what those predicaments are. But somehow it's trying to, because we are living in modernity, it is our predicament. Of course, we should be concerned about it, but we should be concerned, in our view, concerned about it in order to increase this predicament. So modernity can eventually implode. So it in Muslim world anyway. So that it can be overcome. So, but it looks like Allah is trying to make modernity's moral predicament as if it is our predicament, like Muslims' predicament, and we should help to overcome this. That view is sort of Euban's view in a sense, because that's what she said. What's the enemy in the mirror? But we'll see. The political and the economic, however, integral to this self-contradiction. Which self-contradiction he's talking about? He seems to like the word contradiction. Inherent self-contradiction, that is that of modern Islamic, remain derivative of this moral predicament. So modernity's moral predicament is reflected in the moral self-contradiction of Islamic State. How? Which is to say that resolving these contradictions as moral should by definition resolve the political and economic problem. Nothing does. Nothing happens by definition, my good friend. Conceptual world is different from the actual world, and they reflect each other. But anyway, to state the matter even more explicitly, okay, do it please. The inherent contradiction of any conception of modern Muslim. See, here he called modern Muslim state. He was talking about Islamic State before, yeah. So where Islamic State is a contradiction in terms, and now he talks about Muslim State. So he is equating them anyway. Muslim and Islam for him is the same, I guess. And this self-contradiction is somehow part of the moral predicament of modernity. Modern Muslim state, by virtue of the formidable vertical effect and horizontal power of the modern state, capture not only the entire spectrum. So he does. Modern state is a very powerful thing. Obviously, we don't say that he is something absolute, but it's very powerful. It's a Leviathan, as people have called it. But not all states are equally powerful, obviously, and Muslims don't have that much power. And Muslim states are, even actually existing Muslim states are not that powerful, actually. Capture not only the entire spectrum, what has been described as the crisis of modernism, but also implicate the moral dimensions of the modern in our world from beginning to end, but also implicate. So somehow there is a contradiction, inherent contradictions in Muslim states. Some of the contradiction he talked about before, and they are somehow reflection of the inner contradictions or moral predicaments of modernity. So perhaps he would say that in order to overcome these contradictions, we should help reform modern project in our. This book, therefore, is in moral thought, even more so than in commentary on politics or law. In order to elaborate our argument, we must first arrive at a description of what we shall call paradigmatic Islamic governance and the present modern state. These don't know what he means by paradigmatic. Probably he means ideal or these being the preoccupation of chapter 1 and 2 respectively. However, chapter 1 also delineates the concept of paradigm as we use it here. A conception central to our overall argument. I think he means concept. And since this argument will fly in the face of many modern assumptions about law, politics, morality, and the meaning of good life, we must also address the ideology inhabiting, nay, dominating our thinking about modernity, the achievement of modern project. Which ideology is that? Must therefore also call into question the latent and not so latent conceptual assumption underlying modern discourse, namely the rhetorical and substantive discourse, the modern theory of progress. Why don't you define modernity first? Okay, where were we? Of progress. On the other hand, while recognizing synchronic changes and diachronic variants in the makeup of the modern state, chapter 2 attempts to identify what we call form properties that for our purpose represent the essential qualities of this state. Okay. But it would be interesting to know, because he is talking about synchronic and diachronic changes, how does he understand essence of the state? Essence, is it something metaphysical or historical? Okay. Interdependent in their constitutional effects, these form properties will be disentangled for analytical purposes. The idea of sovereignty will and the rule of law will be explained in chapter 3. Okay. So chapter 1, he is talking about paradigmatic governance, and in Islamic governance. In chapter 2, he is going to talk about paradigmatic modern state. And in chapter 3, he will talk about the idea of sovereign will and the rule of law. Okay, I will be examining. In terms of the doctrine and practice of separation of powers, an examination that serves two purposes. First, it will allow us to set forth the constitutional frameworks and structures of both the modern state and Islamic governance, since these are the larger contexts in which law, the legal system, government, and politics are deemed to operate. In other words, this will serve to outline the constitutional background and boundaries of the two systems. What are those two systems? Islamic governance and modern state. Okay. The second and simultaneous purpose, on the other hand, will be to highlight the constitutional differences between the two systems of governance. So the state is a system of governance, differences that will permit a further exploration chapter of the meaning of the law in its relationship to morality. Okay. This largely philosophical account underscoring the qualitative difference between the legal conception of modern state in Islamic governance. What does it mean, legal conception of modern state? The legal basis of modern state. Well, see, we'll turn political and Islamic will turn political in the second part of the chapter. Here, the legal moral differentials identify. The first part will be augmented by political differential that will reveal yet another sphere of incompatibility between Islamic governance and. So, I mean, obviously, we haven't read those chapters. But look, just notice the mismatch between two concepts: modern state, which is an institution, and governance, which is a practice. So there's no obviously modern state itself has a form of governance, or many forms of governance. So the contrast is not between Islamic state. If you want to contrast Islamic governance to modern non-Islamic governance, for example. So the mismatch between these two concepts should be obvious. Chapter 5, narrow the focus of chapter 4, moving from the macro to micro level. Where are the meso levels? From systems of thought and of politics to the realms of self and subjectivity. Okay. That chapter 5 argued that the modern nation state and Islamic governance tend to produce. See again, Islamic governance and nation state. As if Islamic governance is some embodied concept. Tend to produce. So modern state and Islam can tend to produce by their very nature and virtue of their technologies, the self that both inherently possess. Two different subjective formation. Again, the subjects produced by these paradigmatic fields stand at great variance with each other. I mean, if he had contrasted Islamic governance with non-Islamic governance, it makes sense. But in order to prove his point that Islamic state itself governance, he is choosing to contrast Islamic governance to nation state, which are two different types, different levels of concepts. So I don't know how he will justify that. Again, these subjects produced by these paradigmatic fields stand at great variance with each other, engendering two different levels of moral, political, epistemic, and psychosocial conception. Well, these profound differences between the subject of the modern state. There's a lot of Foucauldian terminology of modern state, and though the Islamic governance merely represent the microcosmic manifestation of the microcosmic difference that are material, structural, constitution, just importantly philosophy. A lot of garbage here, and verbiage as well. In chapter 6, we concede, for the sake of that, against all the odds and despite a form of Islamic governance comes into existence. What do you mean? Islamic governance is always there. It's always there, my mate. We then argue that the modern forms of globalization and the position of the state in the ever-increasing terms of these forms are sufficient to render any brand of Islam either impossible. So globalization will never be challenged, or you can't challenge globalization or modern state. Is that the, if possible, incapable of survival in the long run? So there's no alternative to imperialism, in other words. And I mean, how can this argument be like Iran is one of the first modern experiment at that level has survived 70 years or so, or 50 years, I don't know. No, it can't be 70 years, but 77 years. So over 40 years anyway. Despite all odds. So why can't, if we have like 10, 20, such a state, they won't be able to survive? If Houthis can challenge America, Islamic State can survive. However, the aggregate implications of this and earlier arguments in the foregoing chapters are clear. All things on Islamic governance are unsustainable. So he has rejected Islamic State. So Islamic governance is an abstract concept, but how is it unsustainable? Given the condition prevailing in it. So you have to change. That's why we need revolution. You have to change. To the extent that Islamic governance will become dominant through the creation of states within a state, these conditions will be overcome. That is, otherwise, obviously, if they can't be overcome, those conditions, but we have to ask why they can't be overcome. As a good Foucauldian, you should know what has come into existence can be undone. Because it's a historical reality. If it is historical, it wasn't at some time, it wasn't there. So it came into existence within a historical time, so that it can be undone as well, however dominant and however powerful. And I'm not implying it's an easy task. I mean, it will take 100 years at least. But how can you say that it's impossible? I wanted to actually just finish this. Capitalizing on the concept of paradigm and central domain, we move in the final chapter to interrogation of modern moral dilemma, posing the structural conceptual foundation as constituting the root of the moral predicament that modernity on all Eastern and Western has been encouraging. What are the Eastern forms of modernity? Like Eastern justifications of modernity. We insist that, I guess, Muslim modernity, Islam modernity. We insist that if the impossibility of Islamic government in the modern world is directly the result of the lack of an auspicious moral environment that can meet the minimal standard experience of governance, so idealism, then it is imperative to connect this morally based impossibility with the wider problematic context that modernity's moral difficulties have engendered. Hence, we argue that this impossibility is merely another manifestation of a number of other problems, not least which is the increasing collapse of organic social unit, the rise of the oppressive economic form, and most importantly, the havoc wrought against the natural habitat and environment. So is he assuming that all these dilemmas cannot be overcome? I mean, the way to overcome these is to reject modernity and overcome modernity. All these are seen in this book as philosophical, moral, and epistemic issues. As such, they are material and as much as they're indeed looking closely at the internal moral critiques within Western postmodernity as against Eastern postmodernity. I guess we find close parallels, even a virtual identity between them and the latent meanings the modern Muslim call for the establishment of Islamic governance. Okay. Last few. This book has been written with a view of making it its language accepted to a wide audience, really, beyond specialists in law, politics, and philosophy. Much of its subject matter about Islam has been simplified and stripped of most technical detail, though without allowing the discussion to descend in simplicity. In order to avoid the latter eternal cost, I found it necessary to assume at many points throughout the book a certain body of knowledge without which we would not be able to assume certain body of argument, because such knowledge is necessary for an adequate appreciation of the latter. knowledge. Well, so far he has thrown a lot of concepts at us, which doesn't bode well. But we'll see. I have adopted the practice of providing various accounts of knowledge in these places in the book where they are absolutely essential and most relevant. I have referred to the reader to these during other discussion were there necessary, even indispensable background information. Needless to stress then that these cross-references are not to be seen as merely a convention of scholarly writing, but as essential to providing necessary amount of knowledge for each of our argument to be properly appreciated and assess. An alternative to this cross-reference approach would be to digest my earlier writings such as Sharia history, theory, and practice, less preferably much shorter introduction to Islam. Finally, the word of caution. Extensive and detailed historical narrative proffered throughout the following chapter. This book is not merely a history of Islamic law. While it represents no significant departure from the substance of narrative I've expounded in Sharia introduction elsewhere, it does adopt a distinctive narrative form, which is to say, while it acknowledges and accounts for diversity, messiness, and violations of Sharia long history, violations, it capitalizes on the concept of paradigm in order to retrieve from a paradigmatic structure the moral dimension that nonetheless pervade these complex and messy realia. What is realia? So I think that's it's the introduction finishes. Now I don't know whether we'll read the rest, but if we do, you will lie. Okay, thank you.